Hey, so let's go through your essay. You've done a really, it's a good job that you've done, like, just to start off with. I know it's a little bit short. You probably haven't spent that much time on this since you did your assessment, which I know had a related text, and this one doesn't, right? So I actually prefer that it's shorter because I feel like then you can add more and kind of really flesh out and develop your analysis rather than having a lot and then being like, oh, where do I cut? I think you've got a good amount of content in terms of like examples from the text and so on. But there's definitely room for you to improve how you're talking about those particular techniques and those particular ideas. So let's have a look at it. So really quick one just to start with. Just make sure that when you first say a text, you need to use the full name. So don't just put the numerical number because the actual name is 1984. So the full words, and then you need to underline that. And then you can put brackets 1984 and underline that. And then every time you talk about it, you can now put 1984 and then put an underline. Probably still check that with your teacher. Some teachers absolutely hate any kind of abbreviation. So just make sure that you check, but that's pretty standard for the HSC anyway, how I've said to do it. Now, your introduction, so it's good, like you're trying to answer the question, you've got, stuff about complex emotions, and, you've obviously introduced Orwell's text. But the main thing that's missing here is you talking about Orwell's purpose in creating this actual text, because it's only going to give you a certain level of sophistication and therefore a certain band or mark if you just talk about what's in the text. You need to talk about what's in the text in relation to its context, right? And so do a bit more reading about this if you don't know too much about it. You don't need to go heaps into the history of it. I normally find if you just read the introduction of your novel, there's some really good stuff in there just to kind of get your head around it. But I've put some basic stuff in this particular comment here. So yeah, as I've said, you need to have a stronger contextual discussion about what Orwell's purpose is in writing this text. It's crucial to getting bad 6. So you need to answer questions like, why is Orwell depicting a society where emotions are limited through regimentation by an authoritarian regime? So I just took one of your sentences and turned it into a question. So basically, yeah, like why? Why is he shown this limitation in this authoritarian regime? Why is he showing a society that's seeking to oppress or control a population and ensure a conformity? Right? Very important questions because, it wasn't just like a fiction. He actually has a very strong political agenda here. And he's making a social and political commentary to the people that are reading his book. And the main thing he wants them to know is that if we let these authoritarian regimes take over or give them power, look at what's going to happen. So you've just got the very recent fall of the Nazi regime. You've got the rising powers of China and Russia. And he's really imploring people not to give up their own personal, like their autonomy, their freedoms, because ultimately it's people who put leaders there, right? If people don't support somebody, then they can't become a leader. They can't become an authoritarian power, right? So his whole intention is he's taking things that are happening in our current era, which people probably just kind of get used to, right? Like, if something happens kind of gradually and maybe it doesn't fully impact your own personal life like that dramatically, that quickly, then you don't really even notice it. But if you put someone in like a futuristic world where they get none of those freedoms that they currently have, or there are so many changes here, like there's, loss of relationships, you can't express yourself, you're being watched all the time, there's so many things that when we read it, we're like, oh my gosh, like that's horrible, I wouldn't want to live there. But if you just put a mirror in front of your own current situation, you don't really notice it to the same degree, right? So this is the purpose of creating a dystopia. It's a a satirical exaggeration into the future of what might possibly happen if we don't make the changes or resist the oppressions that are happening in our current era. And I think somewhere that was really relevant recently was with the whole Trump situation, and obviously there's lots of polarized sides in relation to his leadership, but I think what people were really concerned about was the notion that this guy might have seemed like he was becoming quite an authoritarian power, like just kind of doing what he wanted without any regard for like some of the key values of the country and the era. So it's very similar here, right? So they're in the West, like there's that values of democracy and of freedom of expression and, liberty and all these things, right? So he's showing us a world where that's completely obliterated. Like you can't even rebel anymore. You might try because that's still part of human condition, but ultimately you can't even do anything anymore, right? So when you paint such a dire picture into the future, that's going to really make everybody kind of freak out. And I actually knew someone, they passed away now, but I did know someone who was around when this novel actually came out back in the day, and it really did freak everyone out. It really actually achieved that purpose. So there was so you want to really kind of make sure that you portray and answer your questions from the perspective of why this was done, why Orwell actually wrote this particular text. So anyway, there's a bunch of stuff you can read here. But yeah, it's creating a warning. And then linking it back to the question as well will make a big difference too. So for example, here you could discuss how the emotional human need for safety, could be worded better, but yeah, and stability is contradicted by the desire for freedom and autonomy. So we both have an emotional desire for like stability and safety, which is what these authoritarian governments seem to like promise, right? So you can see like, oh, big brother, he's like an older brother, he's going to take care of you, protect you from the enemies of, who are out there. And then in return, you give up your freedom and your autonomy, right? So Orwell is trying to highlight that the emotional complexity that human beings have will ultimately be crushed, in light of, these totalitarian regimes having the amount of power they have. And so he creates this terrifying futuristic image to reveal the need for humans to resist authoritarian powers that promise safety and stability at the expense of freedom, etc., which is kind of a paradox as well. So anyway, that's part of the rubric, but that wasn't necessarily the question here, but that hopefully all makes sense now. So now that you aren't just focusing on two texts, you've only got one, you can actually have the core text in your topic sentence. And the reason I do kind of suggest this is because then you can continue on this line of actually clarifying Orwell's purpose rather than just kind of going, oh, like human emotions can be controlled through limiting modes. Like, yeah, okay, great. Very good idea. That's actually awesome. But, like, why is this being portrayed? Like, why is, the ability for human emotion to be controlled being portrayed by this particular composer? And that's so fundamental to the actual, like, purpose of paragraph and, like, the essay, right? And so I said here, so you don't blah, 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 blah. Why he wrote the text, how it's a warning to his readers, where he cautions that human emotions can be controlled and their deep complexity suppressed through limiting modes of expression by authoritative. Just wondering if authoritative, you've written that. Maybe just look that up. Might need to be authoritarian. Authoritative might be okay. We'll just look it up. And allow them to maintain power while seeking to homogenize perspectives, which I really liked overall your topic sentence. Again, like see if you can just bring Orwell's purpose into what you've written. I just rearranged your words slightly to show you how that could be done. Obviously underline that. Yeah, good, as in good example of newspeak, but don't just write that in one sentence. So one of the other things you're doing a lot of is you're kind of you're introducing techniques or ideas with, well, more like techniques or examples from the text without saying like what the purpose of those are, right? So like, why has he actually created this invention of newspeak? As in Orwell's created the newspeak in the text to show us that ... right? So maybe you could actually introduce this better by taking some of the previous sentence. So something like, the ability for totalitarian governments to homogenize perspectives and suppress the complexity of human emotion and verbal expression is satirized by Orwell through the invention of newspeak. So yeah, that was just kind of taking a bit of the previous sentence and moving it into this one, which gives you a bit of room to talk about Orwell's purpose. You don't need, according to Syme, I don't think that really adds anything. Plus, then you kind of need to explain him a little bit. You can't just like randomly bring in a character without some kind of explanation. So yeah, just take that out. You could also actually integrate that quote into the previous sentence as well. So you could say something like, the ability for totalitarian governments, we just read all that, is satirized by Orwell through the invention of newspeak, which aims to narrow the range of thought. Because it's a pretty short quote, right? So that fits in pretty nicely if you do it that way. Don't say which speaks about. That's kind of not very sophisticated. I've just given you a link to a vocabulary list that you can be using. There's some really good words there on how to start sentences. So like in addition, furthermore, I think you use that somewhere as well. But there's like a nice list, and then you've got, actually let me just open it for you so you can see it. So these ones create an argument, so in addition, furthermore, etc. Then instead of show, these are some really good words. And then I'd love you to start using a few more words from down here. So words like generates, facilitates, clarifies. Anyway, there's a bunch there and it depends on the sentence. So make sure you're confident about how you're using it. But hopefully those words will also allow you some more vocabulary to enhance your sophistication. So see if you can find something there. And then in terms of the irony, it's a good technique, but you don't really explain it. Okay. So also, they're not really losing the ability to speak. I mean, I suppose you could put it that way, but you could get a much better word than losing, right? So something along the lines of like suppressing or diminishing. And then see if you can go a bit further into what the effect of the suppression of language has had here and how this links back to your question and topic sentence. So specifically, how does the diminished capacity for expression curtail, hold on a second, that doesn't make sense. This is why you need to edit. How does the diminished capacity for expression curtail the complexity of human emotion, right? So I don't know if curtail really works there, but it's kind of like limiting that complexity. And just a thing there, you actually end up so good in terms of proving that. So I loved your last sentence here. Readers then become aware of how complex emotions quelled through indoctrination, prevent revolt and maintain hegemonic power, right? So what I thought you'd done towards the end was you'd really kind of done a great job at hitting back on like how complex emotion has been diminished to show us the dangers of the power of these authoritarian powers, or what you've written there. So that's something that I think could come a little bit earlier. And it still applies here because limiting expression is still limiting emotion because you can't express what you feel. So therefore, that's still, they're kind of quite interlinked with each other. So just a bit more discussion there about the irony. And then why has Orwell done that? That's a key thing too. Like, why is he depicting that? Back to the purpose. And then you said equally Syme's ironically comments. That would actually need to be Syme ironically comments. But equal to what? I don't think that's a really appropriate start to that sentence. And the quote's kind of more of a paradox than an irony. It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. So you need to explain what the effect of calling this newspeak or like this destruction a beautiful thing. Why is he saying that? And what is the purpose of that? And then you've got another quote in the same sentence. So it's kind of like, rather than explaining the paradox or you've then now gone into another quote, which doesn't really work. You need to explain the first one and then you can go into this one if you have time or if you want to, right? So you haven't really, though, I don't really get the connection between the good and double good, along with the complexity of emotional expression. Like it's just not really explained. And it needs to be clear enough that if I hypothetically hadn't read the book, I can still understand that. Okay, so if I wasn't actually even sure what you meant there. So either take it out or work on explaining it better, but make sure that you explain this one first. before going into another example. This makes up for this. Yeah, good. So you're at least here, so you're starting to link back to the effect a bit more. This makes society conforms people's limited speech means they cannot react with sufficient emotion. So that should come a little bit earlier in your discussion. And then link back to the question. And then I like this example here about the tricolon. Again, why is tricolon used? What effect does that have? So so what I do in this type of situation, I just look up the definition of the technique and then see how I can use the vocabulary back in the explanation. So the actual definition of a tricolon is, here, let's look it up. Tricolon. Fine. A rhetorical term that consists of 3 parallel clauses, phrases, or words which happen to come in quick succession. Anyway, that's more than enough. So if you have a look here, I've kind of integrated that technique in with the explanation of the effect. So something like the 3 parallel words creates a succinct tone because it's like fear, rage, triumph, like, well, there's and triumph, sorry. But they're very quick and they're very succinct, right? Which sort of is limited in itself, like very much lacks detail, right? They just like, these are the 3 things that you're allowed to experience. And even in saying them, it's very like quick and succinct, right? So you can see how the use of the tricolon there kind of enhances that limit, the limitation of emotion promoted by the party. This is another good point. You've done a good job here of explaining the effect of the bestial imagery. You said symbolism, either one I think should be fine. But work on developing your analysis a little bit further. So to enhance the flow and the sophistication of the sentence, try not to start with the quote so early on. So when you said there were hisses, it doesn't really flow too well, right? So at least say something like, either you can start with a point. So you could be like, the public submission to authoritarian power is illustrated through blah, blah, blah. Or you could just, because you've already kind of done a bit of a similar point previously, you could say something like, put something like furthermore, or just something to kind of have the sentence flow. Oh, right. Yep. So I've given you examples. So furthermore, the public submission to authoritarian power and the control of regimented feelings is illustrated within the 2 minutes hate where there were hisses here and there among the audience, and then explain the effect of the technique, which was the bestial imagery. I think imagery is more correct, actually. But yeah, either way, just make sure that you can kind of like develop your analysis a bit further. And then you need a final sentence linking back to the question. I wouldn't start a paragraph with furthermore because you're sort of starting a new point. So it's a bit contradicting in that way. And then as I said previously, see if you can continue discussing Orwell's purpose. He's cautioning the reader so that, we don't allow for these authoritarian regimes to, diminish the values of like freedom and democracy and so on. See if you can flip the structure here so you don't start with a quote. So you could start with like, the party leaders, da 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 da, or since you've kind of established a point there, at least say something like, the novel portrays this suppression through the personification of the telly screens, just so it's like a bit of a nicer flow. I loved your analysis here. This is what we're looking for. Okay, so, see how you've taken, like you've got 3 sentences here, which is awesome explaining this. And you don't necessarily always need 3 sentences. But the point is you've got the technique, you've got the quote, you've really gone into the effect of the personification, and how that links back to, the fear and then what this does. Like you've really developed on this one. So I want you to kind of use this one as a model in some ways, for how you discuss all of your techniques. I liked the rest of your discussion. Much better vocabulary. This paragraph was definitely a lot stronger, so maybe you spend more time on it. But you just need to work a bit more back to the question and Orwell's purpose. Why is he emulating this political repression in Stalin's Russia? I loved that, right? So like, why is he doing that? Okay, warning. Okay, cool. And then this one needs a bit more development. It's going to be similar comments. So just see how you can incorporate what I've already said into this paragraph. But, Winston decides to rebel. It's a bit storytelling. he realizes, where he works, it's just, yeah, you can kind of, I think you can make that more sophisticated. And then, he decides to buy a diary. Okay. Why? So what does that represent? Right. So just don't just have like obviously telling the story in a sentence. Again, don't put two quotes that have got techniques in them in the one sentence, because you're not really going to be explaining the effect enough, or with enough sophistication. So split those, go into more depth with explaining their effect. Same thing, epizeuxis, great. I don't mind that technique. It's probably not your average one, but that's not a bad thing, as long as you can really explain the effect of it. So similar thing, I've just gone and copied and pasted the definition of that. So literary or rhetorical device that appeals to or invokes the reader's or listener's emotions through the repetition of words or phrases in quick succession. Okay, so see how you can incorporate that into the explanation of the effect of that technique, as opposed to just here's a quote, here's a technique, and then here's just what the quote says, right? Versus how does the actual technique add to the meaning in some way. Try not to use the word negative, not too sophisticated. And then, yeah, just develop the sophistication of your analysis overall. I loved, as I pointed out before, I really loved where you came and ended up here. And I think this could come earlier and can be more consistent, particularly from your first paragraph. So see how you go with that. Right now you've got 700 words. Okay. So, and that's got the question and stuff in it. So that's not exact. So try to be making it a bit closer to about 1,000. If you've got about 1,000 words kind of ready, then you can, you've got enough time to kind of manipulate that or, rewrite it for different questions. But that's sort of the amount of content you need to head for. Again, like I said, I don't think you need to add more content here. I just think that you can use the examples you've got and just develop more on the actual technique, style, and the purpose Orwell had for creating this particular text.